Our BSP Public Lectures are intended to bring together leading international thinkers and practitioners on topics related to planning in the built environment before an audience of colleagues, students and guests. We've heard already in this series from Professors Carol Williams and Julie Froud on the foundational economy, and Professor Lynn Sagerlin on her book, talking about her book, Power at Ground Zero, Politics, Money and the Remaking of Lower Manhattan. Our series concludes in June with our annual Sir Peter Hall lecture, named for our late and esteemed colleague. This year, the lecture will be given by the Right Honourable Lord Kerslake, Chair of the UK 2070 Commission on Regional Inequalities, in which the Bartlett School of Planning has been a very active participant, and which published its final report today. So if you've been listening to the radio or reading serious newspapers, you will no doubt have seen some of the coverage of that. So it's our custom on these occasions to offer you some hospitality, which will be available in the south cloisters of the Wilkins building once our proceedings here are concluded. If you don't know where that is, there will be a crowd heading in that direction, so just follow it. Please do join us. We would love to see you there, sharing some wine and discussion. Let me now introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Andy Pike, who will ask the question, is fixing infrastructure in the London global city region undermining the UK? Professor Pike is the Henry Daish Professor of Regional Development Studies in the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies, Kurds, at Newcastle University, where he served previously as Director. Andy is an authority on questions of geographical political economy and local, regional and urban development and policy. He's a former editor-in-chief of Regional Studies, one of the leading journals in the field, and an advisory board member for the government-funded What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. He's held a number of visiting positions at East China Normal University in Shanghai, the National Development and Reform Commission in Beijing, Aalborg University, Helsinki University of Technology, and other places. Andy has published widely and wisely. Among his many publications are the books Local and Regional Development, it's the second edition of which was published by Routledge in 2017, Brands and Branding Geographies by Edward Elgar in 2013, and Origination, The Geographies of Brands and Branding was published by Blackwell in 2015. Most recently, he's been the lead author of Financialising City Statecraft and Infrastructure, which is published by Elgar. He has undertaken numerous research projects for the OECD, UNILO, the European Commission, research councils, the UK government, and national, regional and local institutions. He's a fellow of the Regional Studies Association and an academician of the Academy of Social Sciences. Andy's lecture tonight draws on his most recent book, which is available for purchase outside, I think, and perhaps later in the South Cloisters. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Andy as a former colleague from my time at Newcastle University and as a long-time research and writing collaborator and above all as a very dear friend. Without further ado, I'd just like to say, Andy, welcome to London, welcome to UCL, welcome to the Bartlett School of Planning, and the floor is yours.
Right, well, thank you very much, John, for this very generous introduction and for the invitation to contribute to the marvellous Bartlett School of Planning's public lecture series. And thanks very much for you all coming out on this cold February evening to participate. It's a pleasure to be back in London and just a 73 bus ride away from where I was from in Hackney up to N16. And while I've lived up north since the late 80s, it's always nice to be back in London to remind myself that I haven't gone completely native in terms of the broader picture. So infrastructure then is once more at the heart of our national political and economic moment. It's getting portrayed as a central problem, but also a potential solution to a lot of the long-standing social and geographical inequalities we've got in the UK, and also our very highly centralised governance system that has, together with the inequalities, then troubled the UK, I think, for many, many years, many decades. And these kinds of issues have become kind of live in terms of the discussion, particularly in the context now of the new government, the agenda around levelling up, of dealing with the issues of left behind places. And certainly the problem side of the infrastructure question, I think, has been very evident. So this idea that there's been an uneven distribution of public expenditure on infrastructure across the UK, it's considered unfair by certain parts of the UK, it's left parts of the country perhaps lacking investment, unable to sort of realise new and sustainable paths to prosperity. And that centralised government is often perceived as having favoured certain parts of the country over others, and particularly the London City region as the kind of engine, if you like, of the national economy. The tax revenue generator, if you like, that enables the kind of redistribution of surpluses across the UK. And also, of course, it's overlaid then by this centralised governance system and the kind of seat of political and economic power then in the UK. I had to update this slide for obvious reasons now recently. But at the same time as infrastructure being part of the problem, if you like, to the troubling issues in the UK, it's also seen as part of the solution or to resolving such problems. And the Conservative government, even before the election now back in December last year then, has been promising then this infrastructure revolution. It's going to deliver a levelling up, if you like, between these richer and poorer parts of the country. It's going to bind the UK back together again after the fractures of the EU referendum in 2016. And state activism and big infrastructure projects are seen as part and parcel of this story. And alongside that, we're also getting these commitments now to further devolution of powers and resources then being pushed down to local government to increase its autonomy, particularly in key areas like bus and rail services that intersect with infrastructure. And this has become, after the general election result of December, then a political imperative then for this government with its 80-seat majority. This idea of trying to address the plight of and hold on to these kind of Labour seats that turned blue back in December then has become very, very important. So these kind of concerns, the potential for infrastructure then to try and address them then have been very pressing, I think, since the crisis back in 2008, the global financial crisis, where you had a period of reductions in real wages, living standards, public expenditure since 2010 and austerity. And some have claimed that this geographically uneven access to infrastructure then has contributed to this rise in discontent across the piece that's been felt across the country, it's been expressed in the EU referendum and its aftermath. And what we've seen is in the context then of national debate then about infrastructure and things like high-speed rail, HS2, and its initial phase then linking London to Birmingham, you actually got local government leaders elsewhere in a country like Cumbria saying that actually what residents wanted then was any speed rail. And they claimed that their lack of a fair share of public investment in somewhere like Cumbria then was contributing to this discontent that kind of fostered the vote for Brexit then back in 2016. So as symbols then of state neglect, of underinvestment, if you like, in some parts of the country, infrastructure now has become part of the response to dealing with these so-called left-behind places. The ones that haven't benefited from the kind of economic model, the forms of globalisation that have been evident in the run-up to the crisis. And certainly what we're going to try to do in this evening's lecture then is to try and dig a little bit deeper then into some of these questions around infrastructure and its relationships then both to the social and spatial disparities and inequalities within the UK and also its kind of overlap with centralised governance as well. And this draws upon a whole body of work we've been doing as part of this iBuild Infrastructure Research Centre, which ran between 2014 and 2018. It's funded by two of our research councils here in the UK, Economic and Social Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And it underpins, as John mentioned earlier, then some work that we'd put together as part of this Financialising City, Statecraft and Infrastructure book. And this was jointly written then with Peter O'Brien, Tom Strickland, Graham Thrower, and we should disclose John. And I should give my heartfelt thanks to all of them for their collaboration. I wouldn't have been able to write this book and lead pulling together their pearls of wisdom then into a seamless web of the finished volume then without their help. And I'm not sure if he does this when he's chairing things, but he's here to answer some of the difficult questions then once we get into the discussion. And as you mentioned, Katie Crosson's here from Elgar as well. If you're that interested in it, you want to get involved with an actual hard copy version of the book. Okay, so we tried to set this up, I think, as a kind of question, particularly when you're doing this in London, to try and stimulate a bit of interest around this. So trying to sort of ask this kind of, I guess, it's of the zeitgeist, I think, particularly at the moment with the UK 2070 report today. But this idea that, if we're going about in a national context then, trying to fix infrastructure then in the London global city region, then is that creating problems then and undermining our ability then to release economic potential then elsewhere in the country? And the argument is basically that we've got a kind of geographically uneven infrastructure provision in the UK. The UK is kind of trapped into servicing the needs, if you like, of the national economic engine then within the London city region. And this situation then is constraining the realisation of economic potential then elsewhere in the country. That's the argument in a nutshell. Now, we'll try to organise a lecture across 4 different parts. The first one needs to say something about what we mean by infrastructure and to try and explain why it's important. Secondly, we want to try and look behind the headlines to try and understand a little bit better than this uneven geography in terms of infrastructure investment in the UK. Thirdly, then, we wanted to look into this really fundamental set of problems, entrenched problems within the UK in terms of that deep social and spatial inequalities and the highly centralised governance system. This is a kind of Gordian knot, if you like, in the UK context that we've been wrestling with for many, many years. And then lastly, we want to try and conclude on a more optimistic note in terms of what this all means and how we might do things differently and use infrastructure in different ways to try and address some of the UK's divided economic, social and political geographies. So firstly then is really to try and understand then what infrastructure is and why it matters. It's certainly more than physical things like cables, electrical substations, railway tracks and so forth. My colleague at Newcastle, Richard Dawson, has argued that we need approaches to infrastructure that go beyond what he calls bridges and that. These kind of physical things that engineers get excited about. Infrastructure systems certainly provide services that we all rely on for our everyday lives. So services such as heat, light, hydration, shelter, connection and mobility, they enable our kind of basic daily tasks then of cooking, eating, resting, washing, communicating, getting about on various forms of travel, bikes, boats, cars, trams, you name it, whichever way you exercise your mobility. And infrastructure kind of underpins and connects then these sites for fundamental human and social activities in the home, in the workplaces where we learn, work, play across the piece. And as we mentioned then, infrastructure has come to be seen then as part of the fix to try and address some of these global societal challenges then that many countries around the world are facing. So issues around economic restructuring, demographic shifts and ageing in particular, technological transitions, rising inequalities and climate change. Infrastructure seems to be central to part of the response to these huge challenges. And certainly infrastructure is made up then of unavoidably geographical connections between people, physical things, processes, resources and services and so on. So if we just consider a water system, it's got physical things like reservoirs, processes like treatment, resources such as flows of water, and then it provides these essential services of hydration and sanitation for people consuming the water. And Matthew Bishop, in a memorable phrase, I think, defines infrastructure then as the economic arteries and veins, if you like. These are the things that enable people, goods, commodities, water, energy and information to move about efficiently. So they're fundamental things to our modern economy and society. If you prefer, last week tonight, host John Oliver then sees infrastructure then as anything that can be destroyed in an action movie. So there's a little clip on YouTube that's worth a look if you want to see. If you could believe that people will make infrastructure funny, then this is a good rant about it, which I can thoroughly recommend. Yeah. Now, different academic disciplines and professions think about infrastructure in different ways, which is important. Engineers take these kind of whole systems approaches then. They try and see infrastructure then as systems of systems with very strong interconnections between each other and providing these kind of essential services, as we've mentioned. We then have economists then who tend to see infrastructure then as public goods that only the state can provide where markets actually fail. And for them, then infrastructure generates these kind of externalities or spillovers, if you like, that things like connectivity, if you like, that affect the costs and benefits of households and firms. And increasingly entering the picture now, as we'll come back to then, is the role of financiers now. Who've started to kind of see the attraction of infrastructure then as assets that are able to generate revenue streams, enable large amounts of debt for their acquisition. And the government is always very closely involved with infrastructure then as a guarantor, a procurer, a kind of regulator, if you like, of these essential systems and services. And infrastructure basically comes in two broad kinds. You've got a kind of set of economic infrastructures, or hard infrastructures as they're often called. These tend to be things like digital communication, energy, flood protection, transport, that kind of stuff. But then also you've got singularly important as well, the social or softer infrastructure as well, education, health, legal and protective services. So those two kind of branches of infrastructure now are very important to distinguish at the start. And in terms of infrastructure and why it matters then, there's a number of reasons then that kind of underline its importance, its centrality, if you like, in modern economy and society. It certainly shapes then economic, social, environmental, political and cultural activities that people in places can actually undertake, and how this kind of helps or hinders their kind of fulfillment of their capabilities and well-being. Who owns, manages, prices, governs infrastructure then determines then what's provided or not, how much people have to pay for it, for how long and on what terms, and where and when such infrastructure is actually available or not to people in places across the piece. And lastly, and resonantly I think as well, is how infrastructure is owned, how it's run, how it's paid for, expresses the nature then of the whole national political economy and the government's relationship, if you like, with its citizens and its commitment, if you like, to collective provision or not, or the lack of commitment to that collective provision. So in short, infrastructure is vital. It's an integral part of our economy, our society, our polity. According to Jeremy Dodson, we're in the middle of a global infrastructure turn, this kind of rising interest in infrastructure as a part of the problem, but also part of the solution to many of the challenges we face. And this has been kind of underlined in the dramatic increase in interest across governments, business and the wider public in questions of infrastructure. And when we look across the academic community, usually a bit of a lag for the academics to catch up on what the zeitgeist is, but certainly there's been an increasing attention to infrastructure issues. This is just a simple chart then of the number of articles that have infrastructure in their title, which has kind of exploded, if you like, particularly around the 2000s in terms of the number of pieces of work that are actually emerging with a focus on infrastructure. Now, what's important about the current moment are the claims of crisis that attend questions of infrastructure. The idea that national and local governments then have somehow kind of underinvested. They're struggling to fund, to finance, to govern infrastructure in countries around the world. Gaps of various kinds are being highlighted by interests across the piece. And national governments are often seen as being unwilling or unable, if you like, to be able to either borrow the money or raise the taxes to be able to fund infrastructure renewal across the piece. And some gargantuan sums are being discussed as part of this picture. So the OECD, Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, have calculated that by 2030, the total global infrastructure investment requirements, in inverted commas as they call it then, for key sectors, will amount to some $71 trillion. That's about 58 trillion pounds, the equivalent of about 3.5% then of total annual global gross domestic product between 2007 and 2030. So mind-boggling amounts of sums are being discussed by various interests. And claims about crisis, about gaps, if you like, have been kind of articulated and further opened the door, if you like, to external investment then from the private sector and kind of non-UK government institutions. And these financial actors, the financiers we mentioned earlier then, are becoming attracted to infrastructure then as a kind of critical, long-term, sometimes set of monopoly assets with predictable long-term revenue streams that are able to support these high levels of debt. And are also able to provide these attractive combinations then of return, risks and maturities then that are appealing in a low interest rate environment across the piece. So we're seeing a kind of global infrastructure market being constructed by these actors, the demand side of governments at the national and local level, a supply side of capital looking for returns amongst the financial system. And that market's been widening and deepening over time, we would argue, in recent years, where you've got low interest rates after the crisis, uncertainty, a degree of volatility. You've got investors attracted to these relatively low-risk sectors, They balance out their portfolios at the lower risk end compared to the higher risk stuff they might be investing in. And they produce relatively good returns compared to other asset classes like commodities or shares. And you can start to see that there's a number of large-scale international, often national government-led investors then are increasing their involvement in infrastructure. They have a whole series of different spatial signatures for getting involved. So this is just the kind of top 10 global infrastructure investors ranked by their infrastructure assets. But you've got things like China Investment Corporation, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Sovereign Wealth Fund, entities getting involved in infrastructure. Big public sector pension plans from Canada. And they're all growing amongst their huge stock of assets in many cases here. They're growing the proportion that is involved in infrastructure. And some private insurance companies as well, like Legal and General. So today then, what you've got is this idea that there is a kind of matching then of the increased interest and demand then from national and local governments with the growing power, if you like, of these financial actors. And in the book, we talk about this and link it into these debates around financialisation, as it's called, the rising power of finance and financial institutions to get involved in infrastructure. And what's happening, we would argue, and we talk about this at greater length in the book then, is you've almost got the infrastructure going through some kind of transformation then from this kind of public good, this collective good, if you like, into an asset class. And that has very deep ramifications for how we think about infrastructure, how we understand what infrastructure is all about. It used to be only something provided by the state because the market wouldn't provide it at any price in situations of market failure, but increasingly now it's been seen as this asset with revenue streams attached to it over the longer term. And these huge-scale international investors then are starting to scan the investment horizon then to actually getting involved in infrastructure assets. And that transformation, we would argue, is very uneven, spatially, socially, institutionally, but it's certainly something that's got deep resonance for how infrastructure is funded, how it's financed, and how it's governed across the piece. You've got public finance in national and local governments then with their kind of wider set of economic, social, environmental objectives, perhaps longer-term timescales that they're working to. And that kind of world of public and municipal finance then is kind of bumping up and colliding with then private and commercial finance. And sometimes these deals are kind of matched together in ways that kind of provide infrastructure fixes, but they often have very particular characteristics, as you can read more about in the book. So now we covered infrastructure, what it is, why it matters, this kind of idea of financialisation, shifting from a public good into a kind of investment class, an asset class, if you like, with these assets and revenue streams. And now we should turn then to try and understand then, well, what's this uneven geography of infrastructure investment then across the UK? Now, it's important to note historically then that the UK has experienced a dramatic reduction then in government expenditure over the years. If we take it back to the mid-50s, this is just public sector net investment then as a proportion of GDP then, right up to 2017-18. And our kind of halcyon golden years days then were back in the late 1960s, some 50-odd years ago. And that kind of public investment then kind of fell off a cliff during the 80s. And has been bumbling along at really quite modest levels then, which haven't really been enough to sort of replace our infrastructure stock, you could argue, over the recent decades. So you had a peak of something like 7% of GDP back in the late 1960s. It's been bumbling along at around 1.5 now, around 2018. Now, if we put the UK in its kind of international context then, again, we can see that the level of gross fixed capital formation then, if we look across different countries, again, as a proportion of GDP, the thick dotted line is the UK, and we, again, kind of held our own, if you like, with our competitor economies, but have really lagged behind in terms of that fixed capital formation then since the early 1970s. So we've got a sense that major economies, Canada, France, Germany, if you like, have been kind of pulling ahead, if you like, in terms of investment in their infrastructure. This history of underinvestment in the UK has kind of left the UK relatively low down the international rankings then in terms of infrastructure quality. Last World Economic Forum listing then, it was in 28th place. Top three then were Switzerland, Singapore and France in terms of their quality of infrastructure. And then when we track down from the national level then to start to look at the subnational level then, that's where we really start to see this very skewed kind of geography of infrastructure investment towards London and its wider city region. Now, mapping all this is no straightforward matter. There are lots of issues around data availability, how to determine the kind of location, the structure, the timing of infrastructure investments. And there's a lot more details on how we went about doing that in the book. But if we just take the kind of broad picture data then, just straight up Treasury data then from the UK, to try and map out then this public spending on infrastructure by country and region, looking at pounds per head. I was trying to normalise them for the size of these regions. Then we can see that London stands out, Scotland not too far behind, but then the rest of the country then really suffers then from a relative lack of investment then. So we've got a very skewed geography towards London in the southeast as part of that picture, which again is very marked and has been very enduring. If we start to look at other kind of markers of this, there's a good chunk of data analysis in the book, but we'll just pick out a few of the highlights now for the context this evening then. If we have a look at something called the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline Investment by region, so this is for the Infrastructure Projects Authority that kind of looks across the piece on infrastructure investment in the UK. And again, you can see this similarly skewed story towards London, with the other regions again being kind of relatively underinvested in comparison. And of course, if we start to think then that in fact many of those kind of larger scale new kind of infrastructure projects, over £1 billion or so, that are underway or being planned or completed, are very much about connecting to the London city region or actually located in that city region. So these are things like HS2, you could argue is a very London-oriented project, certainly in terms of its first phase. Plans then for Crossrail 2, new tube for London, Crossrail 1. You know, if you start to rack up the kind of highest value kind of infrastructure projects, then they tend to have that geographical skew to their organisation too. If you drill down to any particular infrastructure sector then, so just taking transport, again looking from 2012, 2013 to 2016, 2017, looking at per capita investment then across the country and region. Again, this thick blue line, you can see London stands out head and shoulders then across the rest, compared to the other kind of modest growth, if you like, in terms of the other regions then across the UK. So you've got a very marked geographical skew, we would argue then, to this geography of infrastructure investment across the UK. Now, you could argue, of course, that not all infrastructure investment is by the state, and of course you'd be right. Certainly some of it is in the private sector, especially in things like energy, telecommunications and water, because of that history of privatised utilities and infrastructure systems and services. The data on private sector investments then is even worse than the public sector data in terms of getting aggregate pictures for this. One set we can look at is where you've got these private finance initiative, private finance 2, these kind of public-private type mechanisms that the state has used. And they actually show you some kind of geographical spread. And again, you can see that by value then, both these PFI and PF2 projects back in 2016 then, concentrated towards London and the greater kind of broader city region towards the south, relatively higher in the northwest and in Scotland as well, but often skewed in that data, I think, by some very large and individual projects. So northwest stuff, nuclear power in Cumbria, I think, has quite an influence on that map. So these are examples, are just a taste of the kind of analysis in the book that kind of underline this idea of a very uneven geography of infrastructure investment across the UK, this very strong orientation then towards the London city region. So we end up then with the UK then having a very differentiated infrastructure set of systems. So where people live, work, learn and play across the UK then is serviced by very different systems and structures. And it seems this much is being acknowledged, and it's been long acknowledged, arguably in some quarters then, by national and city governments and local governments, other agencies, private institutions and civic actors. And that geographical unevenness results then in very unequal participation then on the part of people in economy, society, polity and culture. There isn't a sense of equality about infrastructure systems and services across the UK. Life chances, opportunities, well-being, if you like, across the UK shaped by this kind of uneven geography, we would argue. Now the question is, of course, is why have we ended up in this place? Why have we got such a skewed geography to that infrastructure investment across the piece? And I think here is where we would kind of point towards 4 elements, I think, that really kind of enable us to account for this. The first of which I think is the UK's kind of economic geography, these very deeply entrenched geographical inequalities in social and spatial terms. The second one is the kind of economic and political dominance of London then, and the UK's kind of highly centralised governance structure, which kind of reinforce those things. The third one is a bit more of an anorak one, which is about how project appraisal methodology then skews public investment geographies across the piece. And the last one is really the way in which those things kind of reinforce and put local governments in other parts of the country in difficult positions then in terms of funding and financing and governing local infrastructure investments. So let's have a look at each of those four in turn now and dig a little bit deeper. So the first one is this idea that the UK has long-standing, deep-rooted social and spatial inequalities. I think these are long-established facts. As the UK has kind of deindustrialised, transitioned into a service economy, its economic geography has become more and more concentrated in London and the broader city region. If we look at its share of the national economy, London increased from 4% back in 1997 to 23%, nearly a quarter of the UK total of gross value added over that period. All the other regions declined in their relative shares over that time period. Historically, social and spatial inequalities have been persistent, they've been growing. If we look at the coefficient of variance or difference between the most and least prosperous regions, then it's actually increased by nearly 7 points if we take a historical view using Nick Kraft's work right back to 1871. Between 1871 and 2007, you've had this growing gap that's kind of reinforced. And on the work that Nick Crafts has done, if he's constructed these historical regional gross domestic product figures, if you kind of index the UK to 100, London increased from 142 to 165 over that period, 1871 to 2007, whereas the North East and Cumbria then fell from 94, still under that national level, right down to 75. So you've got this long run, embedded, entrenched, long-standing set of geographical inequalities. And what you end up with then is this kind of hierarchical, monocentric kind of economic geography to the UK, dominated then by the kind of spatial spike, if you like, that really shapes and structures the broader economy within the UK. And the capital then has become this kind of core economic engine of the broader economy, dense in terms of the number of jobs concentrated then. Duncan Smith's marvellous map then from Casa around the corner. And increasingly that kind of geographical concentration is creating an ever more expansive geographical footprint, if you like, within the broader region. So if we look at the map of people kind of commuting in and out of London, it's going back to the last census data, we can see that that is widening. So people are becoming more and more reliant then on cost-efficient public transport to be able to get in and out of this kind of core centre of economic activity within London. Now, of course, for some, I'm sure there's some in this room, that uneven geography is economically rational. It's an outcome that is fine. It's an efficient, productive way to organise the UK economy. We should be putting large-scale infrastructure investments then into the most populated, productive and largest centre of economic activity and tax generation in the UK. In this view, we would all be poorer if we started to undermine London's economic might. We should accept the use of general taxation that's collected right across the UK to be able to focus on infrastructure investment needs within London. And London's growth, it's argued in this particular view then, supports and complements then expansion elsewhere because of these kind of trickle-down or spillover effects. Consultancy GLA economics then, you might say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? When London grows, the rest of the UK grows. This is the kind of argument that's put forward. And any approaches then to try and deal with these social and spatial disparities then over time then are seen as spreading scarce public resources too thinly to make a difference. Too thinly to actually make a kind of, or move the dial, if you like, in terms of addressing the inequalities. And also not supporting those places that are actually able to grow. So that's a very consolidated kind of strong view that's been articulated in terms of these broader debates. Now for others, again there might be some in this room, the uneven geography then is economically inefficient. London's vulnerable to overload, to the kind of diseconomies, if you like, or costs of this very strong spatial concentration of economic activities in one kind of corner of the country. Leads to unaffordable housing, negative externalities or spillovers then, like congestion, poor air quality. And supply bottlenecks get reached much, much quicker when you have this very, very geographically concentrated spread of economic activity. So land, housing, labour markets, they reach these supply constraints much more quickly than they would in other countries where you have a more kind of balanced, nobody's saying completely homogenous and equalised economic geography. Places like that don't exist, but a more balanced picture than perhaps we've already got at the moment. And what we've got then is that kind of skewed geographical infrastructure layers of investment then means that London and the city region then tends to get higher levels of investment per capita than other parts of the country, as we've demonstrated with some of this data, as part of an attempt to try and deal with those problems. Yeah? So what you've got is this kind of fueling of discontent in the rest of the country then, where they're kind of seen not to be able to get the investment to kind of enable their growth to realise their economic potential. Why? Because it's all being funnelled, or predominantly being funnelled then into dealing with the problems of this uneven geography across the piece. What you've also got as well then is this dominance of London, the second reason that we pointed to before. It's the engine of the national economy. It's the big tax generation motor within the UK. It shapes national government policy. So people often talk about regional policy, but it's regional policy for London and within this national context. Located then within the seat of political and economic power then in the UK, national government often takes this kind of London-centric view of issues. So you've actually got an uneven geography then, that first issue we talked about, kind of being reinforced then by this very centralised governance system then within the UK. And the UK still, in the same way as it's had this long-standing entrenched problems then of spatial inequalities then, has very, very centralised governance then in the international context. So if you look at the Regional Authority Index data, which kind of measures the decentralisation of powers and resources to subnational entities then, the UK sits just above Greece in this ranking and well below them much more decentralised countries then like Germany, Spain and Belgium. And if we look over the longer run, we've actually becoming more centralised across the piece. Sorry, I'll get out of the way of the chart there. And you can actually kind of track over time then, going back to the 1950s then, where we've had very, very low levels of regional authority by this data. We actually got more and more centralised over the 80s as part of that kind of Thatcher government emasculation, if you like, of local government through local government finance. And then we kind of bounced back a little bit, back to where we were maybe back in the sort of 1970s, then following devolution then to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland then from the late 1990s. So what you've got is this uneven geography of economic activity, of tax generation, if you like, that further reinforces then this broader political economy in the UK. You've got a continued growing and kind of net surplus then of tax receipts then over public expenditure in London. So those kind of surpluses make a positive contribution to national public finances. And certainly there's a kind of negative fiscal balance then in the last decade or so. So you've got a fiscal surplus that's generated through that economic activity in London and the greater South East then. And that, of course, underpins that redistributive set of transfers then to the poorer places across the UK. And that kind of aligns with that strong argument that, well, we can't really do anything to undermine the goose that lays the golden egg then in London and the greater South East. So that's an important kind of consideration and complication in this broader debate. What you've also got as well is the way in which those kind of spatial inequalities, that centralised governance then kind of underpin and create a skewed kind of national narrative then about how infrastructure investment in particular should be allocated across the piece. Because if London is the main kind of economic engine and tax generator then for the UK economy then that clearly becomes a national priority then in terms of fixing its infrastructure needs above all other regions and cities across the piece. So where you've got scarce national investment, the idea is trying to deal with the market failures, the supply bottlenecks then within the most productive, economically prosperous part of the country then becomes the most effective policy response. And we've seen that and it's kind of revealed then by these broader figures. The case is made then for investing in rather than penalising the successful part of the national economy. And given its weight then, those kind of London projects then become nationally important as part of that broader picture. Now, of course, it wasn't always like this. We had a kind of geographically skewed story to infrastructure now that we've revealed in this work now in more recent years. But historically, in the post-war period in the UK then, the UK set about building a particular version then of what Steve Graham and Simon Marvin call then a modern infrastructure ideal, where you had a highly centralised, top-down, kind of national framework of state management, of kind of Keynesian economic policy and a welfare state. It was marked by a kind of one-nation politics across Conservative and Labour, commitment to redistribution, integration, modernisation, nation-building, if you like, through infrastructure networks. The idea being that you could try and create broadly similar services across the country for people at roughly similar cost. And the ambition was mostly achieved, of course, through monopolistic type structures with national infrastructure systems and institutions. So you can think back, depending on how old you are, in terms of British Railways, the central electricity generating boards, the motorway network, post office, telecommunications. That big tower used to be the BT tower there before that too. And provision of infrastructure then at this time then was seen very much then as a fundamental role for national government, yeah? Paid for by revenues from general taxation with additional borrowing and a few user fees along the way. Now, of course, all this was broken up over the years, certainly through the kind of exhaustion, if you like, of state-regulated mass production and consumption. The kind of model from the 1970s was kind of disrupted by deindustrialisation, the rise of services, rise in inflation and unemployment, internationalisation, technological change, transition kind of eroded public tax bases then, meant there were kind of growing problems of national and subnational indebtedness and fiscal crisis. And that kind of ushered in then a new kind of era, if you like, from the 1970s, with a much more kind of geographically and socially uneven fragmentation, a splintering, if you like, of that modern infrastructure ideal in the UK. Deregulation, privatisation, break-up of monopolies, the introduction of competition and financialisation, the rise of finance in the infrastructure domain really started back in these years, where infrastructure networks were increasingly kind of broken up, they were unbundled, if you like, with the idea that you could reduce costs outside monopolies, you could increase consumer choice, and this was often to the disadvantage of poorer people and places. And you had a whole series of uneven moves across the piece then towards private interests, public-private partnerships, financial actors getting much more engaged in the picture, and a general antipathy then to public ownership and management, I think, that really became embedded within the broader body politic over the time. National, local governments were part of the problem. They were seen as having underinvested then in infrastructure from those halcyon days in the 1960s, causing infrastructure crises and not securing sufficient private investment to kind of renew infrastructure across the piece. And crucially, attempts were made, successful attempts we might reflect now, to refrain infrastructure items and systems then from these kind of failing public goods, if you like, provided by the state, to potentially lucrative assets with revenue streams and value that could be unlocked by private financial actors. So there was a sea change, if you like, in the thinking about infrastructure at the time. And funding and financing now were no longer just the domain of the national state. They were about public, private, hybrid types of arrangements to try and put these things in place. And you had that kind of fragmentation, arguably, which led to this kind of break-up of the modern infrastructure ideal. And that was really at the heart, I think, of explaining a lot of the highly uneven geography of infrastructure provision across the country that we've seen. And arguably, with the demise of that kind of national Keynesian modern infrastructure ideal, that kind of opened the space, I think, to the kind of assertion of London and the city region and its interest, I think, within that more sort of fragmented and fluid broader context. Shift towards liberalisation, a national political economic moment, if you like, that kind of enabled the assertion of London's interests. And back in 2012, you had business associations like London First then, argued that in the period, I'm quoting now, in the period following the Second World War, we made a conscious choice not to grow London and instead planned for its decline, an approach that was to the detriment of the UK as a whole. So you can see that kind of very consistent, strong kind of view around the importance of London and that broader city region then within the national context. So that's our first two, those spatial inequalities, that kind of centralised governance, the way they reinforce and kind of underline each other, I think, is a really important part of the picture. Now, the third one, and this is the one for the anoraks then, is really this way in which geographical bias has been kind of ingrained in how government administration works. So the UK Treasury has a thing called a Green Book, which specifies the appraisal methods. I'm sure there's many people in this room know more about it than me, which is basically the method for working out the costs and benefits of public intervention and expenditure. And typically their way of assessing public investment then is based upon calculating the current economic or market value then, and it's rated using benefit cost ratios. So this is a classic kind of approach to doing these things. But of course what this method produces then are very geographically skewed outcomes, because what you get is projects that are located in more productive and stronger economies then have higher current economic or market values, so think about house prices and wages that are factored in, and therefore generate higher benefit cost ratios. So they're the ones that always get kind of prioritised then in terms of investment. So that kind of reinforces that geographically skewed picture of investment. This is what we'd argue. In the weaker regions, where you've got lower current economic or market values, so weaker house prices, weaker wage levels, lower wage levels, then you're only getting lower benefit cost ratios. So these are never going to get prioritised in competition with one's investments then in more valuable and prosperous regions. And the Economist cites the example then, infamous example of these Pacer trains. I don't know if anybody's had a go at these in northern England. It's a kind of bus chassis attached to a train. It's a curious hybrid engineering thing, still in service in some parts of the system. But this was calculated then to produce something like 35p in benefit for every pound of cost, whereas your brand spanking new Crossrail trains down here now would generate £2.10 for every pound of public investment. So no, for the Treasury bean counters then, no contest what gets prioritised for investment across the piece. And what you end up with then is a very clear kind of sense of that Green Book method then skewing investment to areas, especially London and its broader city region, then that can generate larger potential economic benefits then for every pound of public investment committed. So you get a prioritisation of investment then in these hotspots that are being constrained by their infrastructure, so the London and its city region picture. And crucially then, you have characters like, he was then Mayor Johnson back in 2012, arguing then that £1 spent in Croydon is of more national value than of £1 spent in Strathclyde. You can imagine how that went down in Glasgow. Now, views have changed a little bit, you could argue, since. Certainly the former Chancellor Sajid Javid then told the Financial Times recently then that approach has helped to entrench inequality by favouring investment in areas where returns are highest, so the argument we're making, and focusing upon removing constraints in areas that are already strong in their economic performance then, rather than those weaker areas. You've got the Mayor of Greater Manchester then, Andy Burnham too, has criticised this approach. He'd argued that when you only judge projects by economic value they create then, they end up going then to parts of the country where the economy was strongest and more likely to score highest. So this Green Book thing is a kind of anorak administrative thing, but it's having real material effects in terms of skewing that geography investment. And Burnham argues then that you have to give greater weighting, he would say then, to areas then that have higher social need, that need some kind of investment in infrastructure then to be able to grow their economy and release their economic potential. So we've got our spatial disparities, our centralised government, our Anorak's Green Book then that's kind of underlying this skewed geography of investment. And the last one then is certainly the idea that there's sustained kind of national underinvestment, and the kind of austerity period then since 2010 then has kind of created limits then upon public funding within the broader context within the UK. So limiting the amount of resources to actually be able to invest in infrastructure. Now, if London is getting a skewed and disproportionate share because of its dominant position then within that broader political economy then cities and regions elsewhere in the country then are struggling to try and attract funding to be able to invest in their growth and prosperity. Now, of course, some have argued that it's not a zero-sum game, that it's either invested in London or other parts of the country. They've called for investment across the country, and certainly the UK 2070 report then, I think, was go big or go home, I think was Sir Bob's memorable phrase today. And certainly that's in tune with this kind of, at least rhetoric around levelling up that we've heard from the current government. But when you've got a kind of a legacy of a public expenditure squeeze, limited decentralisation, a skewed geography of infrastructure then, you're left with local governments across the country then really struggling then to try and pull together capital to invest in projects then to be able to fund and finance local infrastructure investment. And Sir Albert Bohr, former Labour leader of Birmingham City Council then, had his marvellous Jaws of Doom graph then from the early days of austerity, where he forecast then, if you look in terms of the orange thing, is budget pressures then, principally social care for adults and children. There's just been growing demand on that side of things. At the same time then, as you were losing something like 20 to 25% in terms of grant reductions amongst local governments, so opening up this huge funding gap for local government, particularly on the revenue side, which was troubling them because when they could borrow, they didn't really have the money to pay for the interest on the borrowings and so forth, even though it was relatively low cost at the time. So this was creating a very particular kind of set of problems then for local government to try and invest in infrastructure. And what they've been doing then is they've been compelled in many ways then to get involved in very new, untried, untested forms of slightly more speculative and risky forms of funding and financing arrangements. Borrowing against future tax revenues, particularly commercial property, business rates, securing credit ratings and issuing bonds, things that local governments in England in particular hadn't really done before. And what you've got is a whole series then of borrowing commitments to long-term contracts with private interest then, part of this financialisation then, that are going to be very costly and difficult to negotiate then perhaps as priorities and conditions change. And a more risky, speculative, uncertain kind of world, if you like, of funding and financing and governing infrastructure then has started to appear in certain parts of the UK. And many of these financial actors that we talked about earlier then have been very quick to see the opportunities then, the market opening up then, if you like, in that public sector. And there's been a kind of greater broadening, deepening, accelerating, I think, kind of picture, if you like, of these new forms of asset leasing, revolving funds, new tools and instruments, if you like, for doing this kind of stuff at the local government level. So if you put these four elements together then, our kind of uneven geography, our long-standing persistent spatial disparities, the dominance of London in this very centralised governance structure, this kind of skewed project appraisal and methodology, and these constraints upon local government in other parts of the country, then you've got a kind of account, we would argue then, of why that kind of geography of infrastructure then is so spatially skewed across the piece. And given London's growth, its central place, its weight in that UK political economy then, we've seen that its infrastructure demands and needs are ongoing. So estimates of future infrastructure investment for London then are over £1 trillion up to 2050. More than 3/4 of which are for fundamental things like housing and transport. So the issue is where all that gets funded and financed from is a fundamental question then for London and the UK as a whole. And national government, we would argue then, is kind of trapped into supporting that skewed geographical investment geography. It has to sustain that kind of economic engine, particularly given the uncertainty of Brexit and where the UK goes in the years to come. It has to continually kind of shovel infrastructure investment then to defer the point at which all these rising costs in land and labour, housing markets then, and these negative spillovers then of congestion and poor air quality then start to undermine or kind of damage the growth engine, if you like, for the broader UK economy. Now, the idea that you could kind of let the market work and incentivise the dispersal of economic activity then doesn't seem to be working in the UK context. There's been a kind of more of a concentration around London and its city region then, which has been growing then, rather than a wider set of dispersal forces then working across the UK. And that costs money. So the Treasury's own review of infrastructure costs, of infrastructure provision costs then, argue that providing infrastructure then in London then, the costs of it are rising. It will soak up more of that public investment across the UK in fewer and larger scale projects into the future. Provision becomes much more complex and cost because land value is increasing as part of that, and it's much more difficult to insert infrastructure then in densely populated areas than it is on greenfield sites. So you've got a whole series of things then that arguably are bumping up against this rhetoric at national level then about levelling up, about dealing with that fairer distribution perhaps of infrastructure investment across the piece. And meanwhile, those cities and regions down the far end of the graph that we spoke about then are still underinvested, struggling to try and think about where their funding, where their financing is coming from to invest in releasing their economic potential. They're stuck in the shadow then of that skewed geography of infrastructure investment then in the UK context. So if we move towards the conclusions then. So this contemporary moment then, we would argue then as a very distinct set of echoes then going back to the Barlow report on the distribution of the industrial population then back in the 1940s. Now Barlow at the time then expressed concerns about persistent geographical inequalities in the UK. He connected growth in London and the greater South East core then to wider underdevelopment in the peripheries elsewhere in the country. And these kinds of issues then have returned. They've crystallised around infrastructure then as part of this geographical inequality, this spatially skewed pattern, if you like, of investment across the UK, as we've discussed today. And what we've tried to do in the lecture, I think, is to try and shine a light, dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues to try and understand what's been going on, to try and look at the way in which that kind of skewed geography of infrastructure then is underpinned by inequalities, centralised governance, how we appraise our infrastructure projects, and how we kind of undermine the ability of local governments and institutions elsewhere in the country to cope with the situation they're put in. And this much is seen, it's recognised. Even liberal, market-friendly magazines like The Economist then bemoan how outside London then people will, as they put it, discover infrastructure that looks like it is from another, poorer country. They acknowledge too that there's a divide exists between London and the rest. And this brings us back then to this question of whether, if we're trying to fix infrastructure then in London and the city region, then are we undermining the potential for doing something about infrastructure then in the rest of the country? We've argued that the UK is kind of trapped into this uneven geography of infrastructure provision because of the national economic engine of the London city region, and that's limiting what can be done elsewhere. That's a tangible kind of conclusion of the work that we did in the book. And nationally, we've seen in the Queen's speech back in December then, the government's aim then is to ensure every part of the UK can prosper. You've got Conservative MPs like Neil O'Brien then arguing that levelling up is about fixing imbalances, as he puts it, that are caused by the government itself, particularly in terms of its geographically uneven distribution of what he calls growth-enhancing government expenditure in things like transport, housing, research and culture. So this is being recognised by voices both in government and from the Conservative backbenches. And he argues that maybe some of the kind of corrective things that government can do at that national centre then for levelling up then will involve these redistributions of public investment. So these kind of problems that we're highlighting then are being seen. So what can we do about this situation then? How can we use infrastructure then to try and address some of these deep and persistent social and geographical inequalities and this highly centralised government then within the UK? Now, inspired by a lot of the work that we did as part of the iBuild Research Centre then, we had some ideas. So the first one, I think, is changing the way we think about infrastructure. This idea that we can push against this kind of transition, this transformation of infrastructure from a collective good into an asset class. We need to kind of push back against that, more towards public good and collective provision. We need to kind of reframe and ask the question about what kinds of infrastructure and for whom. And we would argue that we need a people and place rather than a finance-centred approach to how we understand infrastructure. And in this kind of people and place-based perspective then, we're trying to talk about infrastructure then that can provide high quality, affordable, convenient, reliable services then, and protection from risk. The fundamental things that infrastructure should be doing as part of collective provision. We argue that you need to kind of widen the focus beyond this kind of narrow economic, financial kind of set of yardsticks, to try and see infrastructure then as a means through which people are connected then to these wider social, environmental, cultural and political opportunities for their human fulfilment, their well-being, and how we can try and do it in more economically, socially and environmentally sustainable ways to try and deal with these kind of climate crisis issues. And part of this is about trying to get cities and regions, kind of disengaging in some ways from financial institutions that perhaps only want to finance the types of infrastructure that they want to finance rather than what the cities and regions might actually need. And this is a really fundamental kind of point in the context of broader financialisation of infrastructure. And some of the new ideas that come out of this kind of perspective then are the following. So new state-led kinds of institutions. So the idea of regional development backed by the UK's sovereign guarantee, so low-cost funding then for investment, new and more social collective forms of ownership, innovative configurations then of public, private, civic kind of joint working, and maybe new forms, regulated forms then of taxation too. And this might connect in then with some of this work, which I think you heard about on this series then from Carol Williams, Julie Froud then about the foundational economy. Trying to think about what are the essential underpinnings then of a civilised everyday life and collective consumption. And we would argue that collective provision sits at the very heart of that, but with a people and place-based perspective making that far stronger. And second, I think we argue that you need a much more meaningful decentralisation of powers and resources. trying to get institutions in power to be able to put together bespoke forms of people and place-based policies for cities and regions across the piece, and trying to release some of this untapped potential, I think, in other parts of the UK that has been kind of underinvested, I think, from the pattern, the geographically skewed pattern of geographical distribution of infrastructure that we've seen across the UK. And part of that's going to be about decentralising powers and resources, but also about some reforms in the centre, in the civil service and Whitehall. UK still, at least for now, has a relatively high credit rating. It can borrow to invest in infrastructure in the context of very low interest rates. The UK National Audit Office then estimated that interest rates for government borrowing then are more like 3.3%, 3.4% compared to 7.4%, 7.5% for accessing private finance. So it's cheaper in the longer term for the state to do this kind of stuff. The arguments then at the returns, the ability to service that and repay that cheaper borrowing then are kind of underpinned then by the extra growth that infrastructure investment then would actually produce. And you've got people like Nobel Economics Prize winner then Paul Krugman then. He notes that the time to borrow is now. As he puts it, I'll quote, spending more now would mean a bigger economy later, which would mean more tax revenue, larger than any rise in future interest payments, and it would boost job creation too. So there are strong economic rationales internationally for investing in infrastructure and trying to boost those kind of positive economic benefits that come from it. But doing it in such a way that it tries to address that kind of uneven geographical distribution is part of what we will be arguing. And reforming the Green Book a bit. I mean, this has become quite a kind of national thing now, that you can kind of bend the rules or maybe use the appendices that are already in it around social and environmental kind of weighting and different methods for kind of just moving away from just very simple benefit-cost ratio analysis then of appraisal for these kinds of investments. And I think part of this, you've seen some discussion then in the context of levelling up in the new government, the idea that investments can be supported when, as Sajid Javid said before he lost his job, then investments that could offer less bang for the buck, but they can still be supported because we can bend the rules a little bit from what's there and written down in the Green Book. So to finish then, in tackling these fixes then for London's city regions infrastructure, the problems they're generating as ramifications for the rest of the country then. This is the landscape, we would argue, where the kind of future articulation of socially rather than financially useful city and regional infrastructures will need to take place into the future. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. So thanks.
So thank you very much for that, Andy. There's a roving mic coming round if you want to ask questions or make contributions. Please speak into it because we're recording this event. So we'll start off with Emmanuel, and then there's Lucy at the back.
Hi, Andy. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions or comments for you. So to start with, maybe the least interesting or important one, can I try to challenge a little bit the picture you drew about the unevenness of this infrastructure? So you talk about infrastructural spend per capita and across the country, but surely more people work in London than people who live in London. And if we try to also standardize with pounds earned, this picture is probably going to be less skewed than what you described. But that's not as important. I think we all agree about this unevenness. Mm-hmm. And my question for you is the following. What is the problem? Is it the unevenness? Is it how skewed the distribution of spending is? Or how low is the investment in the rest of the country? Because it's not a zero-sum game, as you said. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, you have a go at that one, Andy, while...
Okay.
No, it's further back. Anyway, answer that one, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Manolo. Yeah, a very good points that you make. I think, certainly you can cut the data in different ways to have a look at this. Clearly, there are effects, as you say, from that kind of commuting pattern where you've got lots of people, as you say, working not living in London, but they're still, because of that growing footprint of London, they're becoming much more reliant then upon the infrastructure. So again, part of that conventional established kind of view is that, that's the very good reason for investing in London, because more people are there, they're most productive, they're the highest skilled, and so on and so forth. So that kind of reinforces the existing picture. And, if you were to, you can do... we don't have great regional prices data, I suppose. The economists always tell us in terms of trying to work out, what is really, if you took that into account in terms of growth, maybe disparities in the UK would be a bit lower, if you actually looked at cost of living in different parts of the country. So, you could get a slightly different picture, but we would argue that there's still the overarching kind of structure of that is still uneven, and that's proven across a range of data analysis. I think the problem, as you mentioned, is twofold. Yeah, it is that skew, the imbalance of it, because it's had that kind of resonant effect in reinforcing spatial inequalities of kind of being underlined by the centralised governance structure. So it's kind of got worse, if you like, over time rather than getting better. So it's not as if you've got a kind of tilted playing field that's suddenly righting itself in some kind of equilibrium way over time. That's not happening. So the skew's the problem. And then also what's left then on the table then, as we've said then, for those cities and regions outside London. And increasingly they've been kind of almost left to fend for themselves in many ways to try and experiment with these new forms of funding and financing, which, we won't know for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years whether these have ended up being good deals or not. They're borrowing against... business rate uplift in places like Nottingham and Newcastle over a 25-year period, and it's a bit of a fingers crossed that you'll get the business rate uplift to be able to help you repay back that borrowing. So, as we said, that it's the skew of it all in terms of the national picture, but then also that low level of what's left on the table, I think, for those other cities and regions that are there. So, they're very good points, I think. Yeah.
Lucy?
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. That was a really interesting talk, and I tend to agree with your points about the underlying causes of long-standing structural inequalities and the call for devolution. And in the launch of the UK 2070 report this morning, Andy Burnham was saying that, one of the great benefits of devolution is that you tend to bump into people more often if you're more local to them as a politician or a local leader. Judith Blake was saying that as well. But what I'm wondering is there's an element, and this was also part of the UK 2070 report, there's another element which I thought was missing, although you may have built it into your framework of those four things that sort of fed into the uneven geography, which is the lack of spatial planning outside of London in the UK. And of course, infrastructure tends to drive what is spatial planning by the back door in England today. So I'm just wondering, and particularly thinking about the sorts of infrastructure, the new infrastructure that's coming through, for example, flood defences, renewable energy infrastructure, these sort of things which developers can very much cherry pick where they might go, and maybe not led so much by the need to build up an economy. So to what extent would planning itself be part of your analysis of the financialisation?
Okay, can you just pass the mic in front of you to Michael? Yeah, answer that one, Andy.
Andy, great talk, but you didn't use the magic word statecraft, which you've got in the title of your book. Please, can you explain what that means?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Right, another hand up. Do you want to come around this side and give this side a bit of a go? Do you want to answer those questions while we're distributing the mic?
Okay, Lucy's point then, yeah.
Just hang on.
I mean, I think on the devolution thing, it's an interesting story in terms of infrastructure and financialisation. Tom Strickland, one of our co-authors in the book, did a PhD sort of comparing the US and UK. And in the US, where they have a much more decentralised system, they have much wider range of local tax instruments, and they've got themselves in a much greater pickle in many of these cities in terms of financialisation and infrastructure, with huge kind of indebtedness, these kind of really kind of asymmetrical deals with private consortia, Macquarie Bank, these sorts of characters. So you kind of look at that as a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, in many ways. And in the book, we say much more about this, that actually the centralised governance, in a way, even though the local authorities, as we were making the previous point, have been kind of left to their own devices a little bit, it's kind of dampened or sort of constrained financialisation in many ways in the English and UK context, because there hasn't been much decentralisation in it for them to do it. So we have to be very careful when we make calls for further decentralisation of local taxes, because you then have to think, well, what do these newly empowered, commercially minded chief financial officers in local governments actually want to do with those tax revenues, you see? So we have to be a little bit careful about that. I mean, certainly we part of the analysis is about the devolution of powers and resources, but that has to be handled really carefully, I think, in terms of how that's kind of worked through. Yeah, the spatial planning one is interesting, because, of course, the part of what the local governments in other parts of outside London and that are trying to use their planning powers then in creative ways then to try and do some of this funding and financing of governing. So there's more in the book, I think, on the planning side of things from what we've described today. But I think it does still come back to a very centralised system, fragmentation at local government level of planning, the kind of disjunctures often between local enterprise partnership and local government kind of geographies, institutional geographies, the lacking of an intermediate tier to look at those kind of bigger than local issues, which typically infrastructure tend to be, and the inability then to kind of, corral and connect together in financially kind of sustainable ways, then ways of doing those kinds of big northern infrastructure projects. I mean, Northern Powerhouse Rail and things like this then are always, they're talking to the centre about this. It's not as if you could try and do all that in the north with northern resources, So I think the planning bit is a key part of the story, of which there's a bit more in the book. Mike, ever prescient question about statecraft. This is the public lecture version, yeah. So I think we parked statecraft as an idea. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. I mean, in a nutshell, what we were trying to get at was to move away from, in kind of urban governance and development and policy circles, then this idea that you have these very kind of simple categorizations. There was a managerial urban governance, an entrepreneurial urban governance, and now people are saying what's happening now is a financialised urban governance. And we tried to argue that, well, it's a bit messier than that. In the UK context in particular, you haven't got this kind of very decentralised story. You've got a very centralised story. So managerialism, which apparently was a historical era now, is still very rife in the UK context. So we wanted to challenge that categorisation, and we went looking, of all places, to Jim Bullpitt and territorial politics in the UK and this idea of statecraft, which has a whole series of interesting ideas in it, which tries to give a bit more of a kind of understanding of the agency of local government and its interactions both with the centre but also with other kinds of actors, and in particular from our perspective then financial actors. So we would argue that as we were saying before from Manolos's point, what's left on the table now is requiring very, very innovative and novel forms of statecraft by local government to try and fund, finance and govern infrastructure in this kind of context. So.
Okay, there's a question here and then there's one behind you. So you ask your question.
Do you think this infrastructure investment-based regional poverty trap? If so, would it be fair to say this type of poverty trap is the reason why the Treasury would underestimate the returns on when they're doing evaluation on the infrastructure project based on their Green Book?
Yeah, I didn't hear that so well.
Say it again and speak loudly.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an infrastructure investment-based regional poverty trap? If so, could this be the reason why Treasury would underestimate the return on the infrastructure when they're evaluating the returns on the Green Book?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think with that one, I mean, as we try to say, I mean, this is getting pointed out not just by us, that the method of doing it then is creating these geographically skewed kind of effects. Because, I mean, when you talk to the civil servants and the Treasury people, they'll say that actually there is guidance in the appendices in the Green Book that would allow social and environmental factors to be taken into account more readily. But what tends to happen is because the actors on the ground are more used to communicating with the Treasury in these narrow economic terms, they always fall back on making the economically oriented case for these public interventions. I'm sure there'll be people in the room with deeper knowledge on this than me. So while they could use more social and environmental dimensions to these kind of cases, they don't tend to do it. The default is to keep it to an economic set of arguments, which they're never going to win if you're in an area with relatively lower wages and house prices. So you're stuck almost reverting to one element within that green book to make the case, which isn't really helping you, because you're always going to be competing for public investment then against places with higher house prices and higher wage levels then, which generate these higher benefit cost ratios. So it's kind of skewed. But the noises are, and the rumours are, that this will be kind of bent a little bit. I'm not quite sure how you bend Treasury rules. Like maybe people will be able to inform us on that one. But to try and get the Treasury is always scared about displacement effects as well. That if you're investing in one part, you might be displacing economic activity from elsewhere. But arguably levelling up is about displacing economic activity. It's about moving it from where you don't want it to where you do want it in these kind of left behind places. So this is part of what the discussion is at the minute. Yeah.
You can follow up over drinks. Yes, sir.
Hi, Andy. Thanks a lot for your talk. Not a lot I don't agree with. Two points or questions, really. One is concerning your four factors, which are obviously interrelated, accumulate together, and it's hard to separate them if you're just looking at the UK. But I wondered if maybe it's in the book, you've done any kind of cross-country analysis to look at how these four factors differ across different countries, and how, therefore, they contribute to the skewed nature of infrastructure investment. For example, in France or Germany, is there a different way of technically analysing projects such that there's not such a financial gain element that would lead to that? Or is there a way of analysing that outside of the UK? Second point, you talked at the beginning about the two types of infrastructure, hard and soft. And yet I'm guessing most of your charts and subsequent analysis was based on hard infrastructure in terms of transport and other stuff. Yeah. But I wonder if you could comment a bit about the soft infrastructure side and whether that is equally skewed in terms of its geographical spread. I'm thinking in particular of social care. We've seen an early financialisation of transport infrastructure and things in this country, but more recently there's been a huge financialisation of social care through equity funds with dubious addresses in the Seychelles, Cayman Islands and things like that. And this is a growing problem in the UK. And I don't know, but maybe you do, about how much that is an issue that affects the UK regionally as much as it does nationally.
Yeah. I'll have a go at those then, Ben. Thank you for those very interesting questions. Yeah, on the, I mean, they're relatively straightforward to answer because we haven't done either of those things really. I think there is an interesting project, funders' notes, about looking cross-country at this, I think for sure. As I said, we drew a little on Tom Strickland's PhD, which was looking at US-UK, but not in any systematic sense. It was more of a kind of using that to inform the UK study. So it is very UK-oriented in that sense. I think if you looked at, I mean, I suppose, the more decentralised governance structure and the relatively less, geographical inequalities in Germany then would be interesting to look at. But there is an issue in Germany, I think, about federal underinvestment in infrastructure, which is quite a concern, and the extent to which the lender are kind of encouraged to take the lead in a lot of that stuff. And there's been elements of financialisation, I think, at city level in Germany, from my understanding, but we don't really connect with that too much in the book. I think France, much more top-down, centralised kind of model, but perhaps more of an understanding that infrastructure is collective provision in France, I think, still, rather than, almost a public utility kind of version of infrastructure, rather than these kind of assets with revenue streams that would attract external investors. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to have a look at that picture of economic geography, governance structure and infrastructure investment, I think, to look systematically across that. There has been some work, Peter Mackey at Leeds University, the sort of transport economics people up there, I think, have had to look at these project appraisal mechanisms in different countries and how they provide these kind of different weighting systems to be able to deal with some of those inbuilt sort of skews and biases, I suppose. So I'd refer you to his work for that one, Ben. And then, the social infrastructure, we didn't look at that. I mean, you're into education and health. I mean, again, a fascinating study for somebody to do, I think, in terms of that provision. I mean, it goes back a little bit, I suppose. That's going to be skewed by population because these are kind of, demand-based things in terms of health and education provision. But it would be a fascinating one to look at. And then, similarly, social care as well. I think, haven't Carol Williams and colleagues done some work on financialisation and private equity and social care, but I don't think it did very geographical work on that, but there's certainly some work that they have undertaken, but not in what we did in the book.
There's also a sort of emerging issue in the financing of children's care homes, which has been privatised and financialised. Yes, sir.
Yeah, quite a simple question, this, and you may already have answered it in, isn't the fact that London is close to other countries like France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, isn't that a factor in the growth of London, the growth of its importance and its compared with the rest of the UK?
I mean, certainly, I think London. If you look at Phil McCann's work on his looking at the sort of national regional problem in the UK, he would argue that the London and its city regional economy is decoupled from the rest of the UK because it is more globalised. Never mind Europeanised, it's globalised in terms of its broader economic relations and connections. If you were to look at financial services, for example, the links are there with sort of Tokyo and Wall Street in New York. It's that kind of broader set of globalised economic relations, which I think are very important within the London economy's growth. And what was interesting, I think it was on the radio this morning now in discussing this kind of third runway at Heathrow discussion, that I think some of the criticism that's been levelled at that is it's about a global London, not a global Britain. It was one of the points that was made in the debate this morning. So, again, you'll get views of people saying, well, the UK economy benefits from that then because it's still the capital city and you get all that kind of economic benefit and spillover from that. But then that comes at a relatively high cost then for the rest of the country then if you've got to use all that nationally collected taxation to deal with that over-concentration then in London. So it's, London's role, yes, is a very positive thing economically for the UK in some readings, but then you've got to try and think about Andrew Sayer might put it, can you afford London in the UK context? Because it's expensive to service in infrastructure terms, as we've seen from some of the data that we've collected and talked about this evening.
That's a good title for an article, Can We Afford London? Fulong, and then Michael, and then I'm going to end it. I know there are other people who want to ask questions, but...
Yes, thank you, Andy, for your stimulating talk on uneven geography of financial infrastructure investment. And in your book, you talked a lot about the context of financialization. You elaborated a little bit when you answer Michael's question. And I wonder, what's your precise position? Why would you prefer call it new managerialism rather than financialization? Right. Do you think new managerialism is a variegated version of financialization or an alternative or different? Or could you elaborate a little bit more?
And can you, if you pass the microphone to Michael, did you want to ask a question, Michael? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay, I've enjoyed this very much too, and I think it's very rich and wonderful. I'm just worried that this excellent emphasis on financialisation could and should have taken you a bit further into the whole business of real estate markets, housing, and related issues. What I have in mind is that to some extent, and I don't see anyone really trying to estimate it, this growth of London is an illusory growth. It's the growth of land values, of house values, of incomes flowing from that, of the rents which people are paying to landlords, of the value of the capital stock of land and buildings in the centre and so on, and a lot of the infrastructure investment is propping that up and really a channel for government money to end up in the pockets of owners of land and property. We had a lecture in this room from Michelle Dix, who was in charge of the planner from TfL, in charge of Crossrail 1, and she proudly says, well, Crossrail 1 would cost Crossrail 2 would cost 30 billions to build, which was the estimate then, but it would add 60 billions to the value of the owner-occupier housing stock. You know, now this is a this is an elephant in the room, and the elephant is dragging the country in a particular direction, and I'm not sure you're challenging that quite enough. That may be a good thing.
Right, so last word from Andy, and then there's time. I know there are other people who wanted to ask questions, but we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over a glass of wine. So, Andy.
Yes, okay. Well, thanks, Fulong. Yeah, it's a very good point. We talk at much more length about statecraft and financialisation, I think, in the book. And I think the title as well, we were trying to get at this idea of financialising statecraft at the city level, because a lot of the literature in financialisation, I think, can be a little simplistic in terms of the idea that it just, financialisation kind of arrives like this juggernaut, everything gets financialised and then it kind of moves on. But we would argue, and our understanding of financialisation is that it's much more of a process, you know, where these relations, these rationales and logics, if you like, start to enrol actors, both from the private, the sovereign wealth, the pension funds, the state, the local actors then within this process. And it's a very uneven kind of process, socially, geographically, institutionally, and that's very important, I think, in terms of our broader understanding of it. Now, when it comes then to, and it relates to Michael's point perhaps, okay, so we are in a very financialised economy within the UK. It's dominant as a sector within national political economy, has been over a long period of time. And the question does become then, well, how, if you wanted to shift the political economy from being more financialised, how would you go about doing that? And I think that, you know, that's a big question way beyond what we were looking at in the book, but that really, I suppose, is part of the terrain then of thinking, well, if you wanted... I think we talk about the idea of, well, how could you have kind of unfinancialised capital? Because you're still talking about capital that you need to invest in infrastructure. But can you have a definancialised version of that doesn't have this kind of hot wire of a profit motive sort of hardwired through it, where you've got, as Michael was suggesting there, internationalised landowners that are just about extracting rents and uplifting their land value and kind of having an exploitative relationship then with that skewed geography of public investment. And yeah, I think that's the title of another book, really. Yeah, how can you have definancialised infrastructure investment? Yeah, that's one for you to write, Michael. Yeah.
Okay, that's also a good note on which to end. Outlining a future research agenda.
Yeah.
So can I conclude by thanking you for a very engaging discussion at the end, but above all, can I thank Andy for a very rich and well-prepared presentation. You know, it's difficult for me to express how much admiration I have for Andy as a colleague. But we very rarely get these opportunities as academics to say these kinds of things. So I'd just like to add my personal thanks to Andy for coming and doing such a good job and doing the book so proud tonight. So can we show our appreciation in the traditional manner?